In the heart of our quiet, cookie-cutter neighborhood, parked proudly in my oversized driveway, was my personal passion project. A fully converted party bus decked out with neon lights, velvet seats, a built-in DJ booth, and enough sound to make a concert blush. That fragile piece lasted exactly one weekend before the HOA came knocking, this time in the form of a clipboard-clutching, sour-faced board member who looked like he hadn't smiled since dial-up internet was cutting edge. He didn't bother with small talk, he went straight for the throat, handing me a violation notice thicker than a phone book, all while glaring at the glowing pink and blue undercarriage lighting spilling onto my driveway. "Commercial vehicles are prohibited on residential property," he barked, jabbing a finger toward the bus like it was radioactive. I sipped my coffee and took my time reading the notice, which was stuffed with terms like visual disturbance, community aesthetic degradation, and my personal favorite, unauthorized recreational structure. Apparently, my beautiful rolling nightclub was now considered both a vehicle and a structure, meaning they were trying to hit me with double violations. He went on about how the bus was a nuisance, how it was lowering property values, and how it disrupted the suburban serenity the HOA worked so hard to maintain. I cut him off mid-rant to ask one simple question: who exactly complained? He paused, lips pressed so tight they turned white, before admitting there hadn't actually been any formal complaints. This was all the result of his personal drive-by inspection. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. This was about control. He didn't like the idea that someone dared to have fun in a neighborhood ruled by beige fences, approved lawn ornaments, and strictly monitored holiday decorations. I politely informed him that my bus was legally registered as a private recreational vehicle, not commercial, and was fully insured, meeting every municipal code for personal property. That only made him angrier because the HOA's internal rules were stricter than city laws, and they prided themselves on enforcing rules just for the sake of rules. With barely concealed rage, he informed me that I had exactly 72 hours to remove the bus, or face escalating fines of $500 per day, suspension of community privileges like clubhouse access, and eventual legal action if I refused to comply. I asked if he'd ever actually seen the inside of the bus before deciding it was a crime against suburban purity. He blinked, confused, so I led him through the front door of my rolling masterpiece, walls lined with LED panels, a bar stocked with soft drinks and snacks, even a fog machine controlled by a touchpad next to the DJ booth. His jaw hung open in stunned silence for a full 10 seconds before he snapped back into HOA mode, mumbling something about how, "This only confirms how inappropriate it is for a residential area." That's when I dropped my first bombshell. Over half the neighbors had already been inside the bus and they loved it. Birthdays, impromptu weekend parties, even a New Year's Eve bash had already taken place in my driveway, with everything perfectly legal and most of the block in attendance. His face turned the color of expired yogurt, realizing his righteous crusade had just collided with the uncomfortable truth that nobody actually wanted me to get rid of the bus. He tried to shift gears, claiming that it was still an unapproved use of personal property, but I wasn't done yet. I pulled out a stack of signed notes from neighbors who loved the bus, each one praising the sense of fun and community spirit it brought to an otherwise dull street. I even had photos, neighbors dancing inside, kids holding birthday banners across the seats, and a particularly incriminating shot of the HOA treasurer herself drinking a margarita at my onboard bar during my 4th of July party. His eye twitched so hard I thought he might short-circuit, but he doubled down, claiming the HOA didn't need majority approval to enforce rules and that his violation notice stood whether the neighbors liked the bus or not. That's when I smiled, because I had been waiting for this exact moment to tell him something that would turn his day upside down. "You might want to check your own bylaws," I said, handing him a highlighted copy of the very rules his HOA lived by. According to Section 7.4, any vehicle-related rule changes required a community vote with at least 65% resident approval, and from what I could tell, my bus had a fan club that accounted for at least 80% of the block. His confidence wavered, his grip tightening on his clipboard like it could protect him from the facts, but I wasn't finished. I handed him a printed sign-up sheet titled, "Save the Party Bus," already filled with signatures from nearly every homeowner on the street, including one suspiciously familiar scribble that belonged to his own next-door neighbor. He stared at the paper like it was a death certificate for his authority, and before he could recover, I delivered the second blow. If he wanted to escalate this, we could go full community vote, a process that would not only overturn his violation but could amend the bylaws themselves to explicitly allow personal recreational vehicles like my party bus. He stormed off without another word, leaving the violation notice crumpled on my driveway, but I knew this wasn't over. The HOA wasn't just fighting my bus, they were fighting the entire street's right to have fun, and the worst part for them? The neighbors weren't on their side. The party bus was here to stay, and if they wanted a battle, I was more than ready to turn this into the most ridiculous suburban rebellion they'd ever seen. The very next morning, the HOA launched what can only be described as a full-blown smear campaign, plastering the neighborhood's community board, email list, and website with dramatic warnings about my so-called illegal nightclub bus. They framed the bus as a public nuisance, claiming it had caused noise complaints, traffic congestion, and even implied that it might attract undesirable visitors into the neighborhood. It was laughably over the top. They made it sound like my driveway was a nightclub parking lot crawling with bouncers, bartenders, and drunken tourists spilling onto manicured lawns. What they didn't realize was that every claim they made could be instantly disproven, because I had security cameras covering my entire property, including the street in front of it. The footage told a very different story. It showed neighborhood kids playing near the bus during daytime parties, adults enjoying perfectly reasonable evening gatherings, and absolutely zero evidence of the chaos the HOA was trying to manufacture. But they didn't stop at propaganda, they started weaponizing their petty powers in every way they could. Within hours, I received 4 separate violation notices for everything from improper lighting, they meant the underglow on the bus, to excessive driveway use, apparently having people step onto the bus counted as unauthorized use of private property. They even tried to cite me for unapproved advertising, claiming the simple act of putting a "party bus this way" sign on my lawn for my neighbor's birthday counted as commercial promotion. It was absurd, but it gave me all the ammunition I needed to expose their desperation. I immediately called a neighborhood meeting, not a board meeting, an actual resident gathering, and invited every homeowner to come see the bus for themselves. When the evening arrived, nearly the entire block showed up, some bringing lawn chairs, snacks, and even a portable karaoke machine. With everyone gathered, I projected the HOA's exaggerated complaints onto a screen mounted to the side of the bus, reading them aloud like a roast at their expense. The laughter was contagious. People couldn't believe the HOA had gone this far over something that had literally improved neighborhood morale. Then, just for fun, I played my security footage side by side with the HOA's claims, dismantling their narrative piece by piece until it was obvious to everyone they were lying. But I wasn't done. I presented the full petition I'd collected, with over 85% of the street's signatures, demanding a special community vote to officially amend the neighborhood bylaws. The amendment? A simple clause protecting residents' rights to own, customize, and park personal recreational vehicles, including party buses, on their private property. Even better, I tied it to a new rule requiring that any future HOA fines related to vehicles must be pre-approved by a full resident vote, stripping the board of its power to invent rules on a whim. The crowd loved it, and the HOA board, forced to attend under neighborhood pressure, sat there pale-faced and sweating as their power slipped away in real time. Pearl Necklace Woman tried to speak up, muttering something about property values, but before she could finish, my next-door neighbor, whose son had just had his birthday party on the bus, cut her off. "Property values?" he said, laughing. "We've gotten more interest from buyers in the past month thanks to this bus than in the last 5 years combined." Turns out, real estate agents had started casually mentioning the bus in listings, calling our street the most fun block in the neighborhood. Potential buyers loved it. People were actually attracted to the idea of living somewhere with community spirit instead of living under the thumb of a petty committee. The HOA president tried one last desperate move, claiming the bus was still in violation because of zoning laws, not just HOA rules. That's when I pulled out my ace card. The bus was fully registered as an RV, and municipal zoning codes explicitly allowed oversized personal vehicles to be parked on private residential driveways as long as they weren't blocking public access. The only restriction? A limit on commercial vehicle storage, which didn't apply, because the bus was strictly for private use. Checkmate. The HOA's argument collapsed under its own weight, and in front of the entire neighborhood, the president had no choice but to concede that the violation notices were unenforceable. But I wasn't just here to win, I wanted to change the game completely. With the momentum of the crowd behind me, I formally introduced my proposed amendment and triggered a community vote right there on the spot, a power rarely used but perfectly legal under the HOA's own ancient bylaws. The final count? 37 homeowners voted to approve my amendment, while exactly 2 voted against, Pearl Necklace Woman and the HOA president himself. It was over. My bus wasn't just legal, it was protected by neighborhood law now. The best part? The residents cheered. They weren't just supporting the bus, they were celebrating the end of an era of unnecessary micromanagement and the birth of something better. As the sun set, we threw the first official block party right there in my driveway, with music blasting from the bus, kids dancing under the neon lights, and parents toasting to the downfall of the HOA's reign of boredom. The HOA had tried to paint me as the villain. Instead, they made me the neighborhood hero. And the bus? It wasn't going anywhere. After the humiliating defeat at the neighborhood meeting, the HOA should have accepted reality and backed off, but petty tyrants never know when to quit. Instead, they regrouped and came back swinging, convinced that if they couldn't beat me with rules, they could drown me in bureaucracy. The very next day, I received a certified letter from the HOA's hired attorney, packed with legal jargon so bloated and dramatic it read like a villain's monologue from a bad courtroom drama. The letter claimed my party bus violated something called the Community Environmental Disturbance Policy, an obscure clause buried in decades-old bylaws that had never been enforced before. They argued that the lights, music, and gatherings connected to the bus constituted an environmental nuisance, a term so vague it could have applied to everything from lawnmowers to porch lights. It was clear they were grasping at anything they could find, but unfortunately for them, I knew exactly how to fight back. Rather than respond directly, I forwarded the letter to my own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense litigator who happened to specialize in HOA abuse cases. Within hours, she drafted a response so thorough, so devastating, that their lawyer probably had to lie down after reading it. First, she pointed out that their so-called environmental disturbance policy had been applied inconsistently and only after they had already lost the community vote, making it a textbook case of selective enforcement. Next, she reminded them that the new amendment protecting personal recreational vehicles, including my bus, had already been ratified by the neighborhood, making their argument legally irrelevant. But the real knockout punch was when she pointed out that the HOA had broken their own bylaws multiple times during their crusade, failing to follow proper procedure when issuing fines, holding secret meetings without notifying all homeowners, and spending HOA funds on legal counsel without proper resident approval. It was a full-blown procedural disaster, and the letter made it clear that if they wanted to go to court, we would countersue for harassment, selective enforcement, and misuse of funds. The HOA board didn't even have time to process the legal threat before the next blow landed, one I had been preparing in the background for weeks. Remember all those financial records I requested? My team had combed through every dime the HOA had collected and spent, and what we found was a buffet of incompetence, shady deals, and borderline fraud. Overpriced landscaping contracts awarded to board members' relatives. Inflated administrative expenses with no documentation. Thousands spent on community development studies that never resulted in a single improvement. We compiled everything into a neat, damning report and sent it directly to the state HOA regulatory board, the county auditor, and every homeowner in the neighborhood. The reaction was immediate and glorious. Residents were furious, demanding refunds, resignations, and full transparency into every dollar the HOA had ever touched. The HOA president tried to blame me, calling it a smear campaign, but that argument didn't hold up once people saw the actual financial documents with his signature all over them. The treasurer resigned on the spot, Pearl Necklace Woman went into full hiding, and the HOA president called an emergency meeting hoping to calm the storm. It backfired spectacularly. The meeting turned into a free-for-all, with residents shouting down the board, demanding answers, and ultimately voting to dissolve the HOA entirely. The very organization that had ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist for years was dismantled in a single chaotic evening, all because they picked a fight over a bus that everyone loved. Once the dust settled, I stepped up and offered a simple solution: voluntary contributions to a community fund, managed directly by residents with full transparency, to cover shared maintenance costs like landscaping and park upkeep. No fines. No rules about mailbox colors. No inspection committees. Just neighbors pooling money for things that actually mattered. To everyone's surprise, people happily contributed once they knew their money wasn't going into a black hole. As for the former HOA board, they were finished. The president sold his house and moved within a month, unable to face the neighbors he had once tried to control. Pearl Necklace Woman left shortly after, muttering something about the decline of civilized neighborhoods, before vanishing to some over-regulated condo community where she could spend her days measuring grass height to her heart's content. With the HOA gone, my party bus wasn't just tolerated, it became the heart of the neighborhood. It hosted movie nights, birthday parties, and even a surprise wedding anniversary bash for a couple down the street. Far from being a nuisance, it turned into a symbol of what our street had become: fun, relaxed, and completely free of pointless rules. Property values didn't crash despite the HOA's dire predictions. In fact, they went up. Real estate listings bragged about our self-managed, HOA-free community with a legendary party bus that came with the neighborhood's unique charm. And every time a new family moved in, the first thing they asked was, "So, can we see the inside of the famous bus?" The HOA had tried to shut me down. Instead, they shut themselves down. All because they couldn't stand that someone had dared to bring a little fun into their perfectly manicured world. Now, every time I flip on those neon lights and crank up the music, it's not just a party. It's a victory lap. With the HOA buried under the weight of its own arrogance, the neighborhood finally belonged to the people who actually lived here, not some outdated rulebook enforced by bitter retirees with too much free time. But I wasn't content to just park the bus and let things settle down. I wanted to make sure the spirit of fun, creativity, and freedom it represented stayed alive for good. So, with the community's blessing, I made the party bus more than just my personal project. I turned it into a permanent feature of neighborhood life. First, I gave it an official name, painting the Freedom Express in bold, glittering letters along both sides, complete with a custom logo designed by the kids next door. Next, I worked with some handy neighbors to build a retractable awning and outdoor seating area that could pop up alongside the bus for block parties, movie nights, or just spontaneous weekend hangs. The bus wasn't just mine anymore, it belonged to the street, a mobile clubhouse everyone was free to enjoy. We installed a community playlist system where anyone could queue up songs from their phones during parties, making sure every event had its own unique flavor. Parents used it for kids' birthday parties, teenagers borrowed it for prom send-offs, and even a few retired couples used it to host nostalgic 70s-themed disco nights. The bus became the unofficial heart of the block, the symbol of a neighborhood that had finally shaken off the suffocating grip of rules that existed purely to make people miserable. It wasn't long before word spread to other neighborhoods. People from nearby streets would show up just to check out the legendary bus that destroyed an entire HOA. Some even asked if they could rent it for their own events, but I turned every offer down. This wasn't a business, it was a community treasure. The realtors, once terrified that the bus would scare away buyers, started featuring it in listings, describing the street as the most fun block in the city, and playing up the neighborhood's reputation as a rare oasis of personality and freedom in a sea of cookie-cutter suburbs. Property values didn't just hold steady, they soared. Families actively sought out homes on our street because they wanted to live somewhere that actually felt alive, where kids could be kids and adults didn't have to live in fear of a nasty gram about a non-regulation birdhouse. Former HOA loyalists who had once scowled at the bus found themselves quietly joining the parties, sheepishly admitting that maybe, just maybe, life was better without a committee breathing down everyone's neck. With no HOA to dictate aesthetics, creativity flourished. Yards bloomed with wild gardens, unique sculptures, and custom paint jobs that reflected the actual personalities of the people living there. Holiday decorations became legendary, no more boring white lights and approved wreaths. Now we had full-scale haunted house setups in October, synchronized light shows in December, and the bus itself became a rolling centerpiece for every celebration. When the 4th of July rolled around, the Freedom Express led the first-ever neighborhood parade, decked out in red, white, and blue lights with speakers blasting classic rock and patriotic anthems. Kids rode bikes behind it, dogs wore little American flag bandanas, and we even had a barbecue station set up right off the back bumper. It was the kind of scene you'd expect in a small-town movie, not a suburban development that once prided itself on uniformity and order. But the biggest surprise came when a local magazine ran a feature about the transformation of our neighborhood, dubbing us the street that fired its HOA and found happiness. They interviewed neighbors who had once dreaded walking to their mailboxes, now talking about how the street felt like a real community for the first time ever. Even people who never used the bus still felt the impact. Without the HOA constantly spying, nitpicking, and fining, everyone breathed a little easier, knowing their home was truly their own. The Freedom Express became more than a party bus. It became a symbol, a reminder that neighborhoods work best when people actually talk to each other, solve problems together, and treat homes like homes instead of entries in some bland architectural catalog. The old HOA president eventually moved out, unable to handle the joy and freedom he had once fought so hard to squash. Pearl Necklace Woman disappeared too, replaced by a younger couple who threw a welcome party the very night they moved in, hosted of course on the bus. And me? I still park the bus in my driveway, lights glowing, music ready at a moment's notice, always there to remind anyone who forgets. This street belongs to its people, not a clipboard. Sometimes I'll sit out there alone after a long day, neon glow reflecting off my house, drink in hand, just enjoying the quiet satisfaction of knowing we won not just for me, but for everyone who ever wanted to live in peace without permission slips. The HOA said I couldn't have a nightclub bus. Now the whole neighborhood rides it. And it's never going away.